When we make a clear mistake, a selfish decision, or a careless error, our minds rarely default to immediate admission. Almost instantly, we generate logical-sounding excuses to justify the misstep, rather than simply accepting fault. In casual conversation, ego is a synonym for arrogance. We typically use it to describe an overinflated sense of self-importance or simple vanity. Acting out of character causes a far deeper internal crisis than we realize. This friction is processed as a biological-level threat to mental stability, far exceeding the weight of simple embarrassment. To understand this blind spot, we have to divide the mind into two distinct psychological entities. There is the structural content of your identity, and there is the active mechanism trying to manage it. When clinical psychology first mapped the mind, Sigmund Freud framed the ego as a structural mediator. Moving past his early models of primal urges and strict moral conscience, the ego emerged as a pragmatic negotiator for the mind's internal drives. It operates strictly on the reality principle. Its entire job is to satisfy our internal drives while minimizing pain and negative consequences from the external world. Self-deception is an operational procedure. The ego acts as an invisible manager, editing our perception of reality before we are even consciously aware of the incoming data. The psychologist Carl Rogers provided a framework for the content the ego is tasked with managing. He called it the self-concept, an internal database comprising everything you believe about who you are, from your factual self-image to your self-esteem and your aspirations. This database operates on the consistency principle, demanding all beliefs and incoming information remain perfectly aligned. It prioritizes internal coherence, even if rejecting objective truth. The modern ego is the executive mechanism maintaining that structure, responsible for problem-solving, self-control, and navigating reality. A critical system error occurs when undeniable objective reality clashes with the established self-concept. Psychologists call this cognitive dissonance. If you believe you are a patient person, but you lose your temper, the gap between self-image and lived experience creates an intolerable tension. The manager is caught between a reality it must navigate and a database that refuses to change. Faced with this clash, the internal system enters an immediate crisis of resource management. The stability of the entire identity structure is suddenly at risk. Mediating that cognitive dissonance and maintaining continuous self-regulation requires immense executive energy. Research by psychologist Roy Baumeister demonstrated that willpower and executive function act as a finite, drainable mental resource. Every instance of emotional regulation or complex decision-making burns some of this fuel, leading to a state known as ego depletion. When the ego detects this depletion, it strategically enters a low-power mode. To conserve its remaining fuel, it takes the path of least resistance. Adjusting a core self-concept requires integrating a painful, contradictory truth. It demands complex reality testing and high energy. Denial, by contrast, is energetically cheap. Facing reality becomes too expensive for an exhausted manager. To save its limited fuel, a depleted ego actively sacrifices objective truth for internal stability. To prevent a total system collapse under this strain, the ego pulls from a toolkit of automatic defense mechanisms, actively editing the reality you experience. Through rationalization, it invents logical excuses to justify behavior. Through denial, it rejects the data entirely, warping information to fit the existing self-concept. And through projection, the ego externalizes an unacceptable internal flaw, projecting it onto others, so the internal database remains pristine. This dynamic reveals the mechanics of severe pathology. In narcissistic personality disorder, for example, an individual maintains a grandiose, perfect self-image, yet beneath that inflation, the internal database is incredibly brittle. Because the structure is so fragile, it becomes a parasitic drain. The ego spends its finite executive energy running aggressive defense protocols against any minor criticism, leaving no resources for learning or growth. The manager becomes a captive to the fragile identity it serves. It traps the individual in an exhausting, endless cycle of reality distortion, working full-time just to keep a false story alive. Psychological health is not achieved by destroying the ego. As developmental psychologist Erik Erikson outlined, a healthy identity requires the ego to successfully integrate a chaotic range of roles, values, and experiences over a lifespan. The researcher Jane Lovinger mapped this trajectory, showing that a mature, autonomous ego develops a high tolerance for ambiguity. It gains the capacity to hold paradoxes and internal conflicts without instantly triggering primitive defenses. A flexible manager allows for a resilient database. The self-concept can become nuanced, capable of acknowledging flaws alongside strengths without fracturing under the weight of external shocks. This structural strength underpins Abraham Maslow's research on self-transcendence, a state characterized by moving beyond self-focused concerns. Maslow observed that you cannot safely minimize the boundaries of your ego or transcend your sense of self if that self is fragile. You must first build a robust, fully functional executive manager capable of handling reality before you can ever choose to let go of its centrality. If the internal manager is hardwired to bend reality to maintain consistency, it forces an audit of our own internal systems. What false, limiting, or negative beliefs are you currently wasting mental energy to defend? Recognizing that invisible editing process, catching your own manager in the act of a cover-up, is the essential first step toward true psychological maturity.